Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GOATCAST, the single greatest podcast by one person ever. So, today in this episode, we will be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962. Now, what is the crisis? Well, the crisis is pretty much, it was a conflict between the United States and Russia, where the Russians had pretty much put potentially nuclear missiles on Cuba that served a serious threat to the United States. So obviously we had to react. Now, how did this all start? Well, it all started during the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1962, which was the United States invading Cuba in an attempt to overthrow the government and the leader Fidel Castro. Now, it didn't work, and pretty much the Cuban leader at the time was convinced that the United States would try again. So he called for the Soviets to help them, and they moved over pretty much 90 missiles off the American coastline in Cuba. So pretty much that's how the missiles got there. And after that, a U.S. U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Richard Hazer took hundreds of photos of the brand new built missiles on the Cuban countryside. And so pretty much the next day, CIA analysts spot the launchers in the pictures and identify them as potential threats to the country. And so on the 16th, President John F. Kennedy met with a team of his advisors known as the XCOM to discuss pretty much the level of this threat. And so he was given three options to handle this. One of them being diplomacy with the Cuban leader and the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev. Another one could have been a naval quarantine of Cuba. And the last one could have just been a flat-out airstrike to destroy all the missile sites, which could have also killed thousands of people, which could have also started, an attack back from Russia or the Soviets at the time. But Kennedy preferred the quarantine, and they had to call it a quarantine, not a blockade, because if they had done a quarantine, then that could have, or a blockade, that would have been considered an act of war, and they didn't want that, so they call it a quarantine. So on the 22nd of October, 1962, in a very dramatic 18-minute television speech, John F. Kennedy notified all Americans by revealing unmistakable evidence of the missile threat, and pretty much saying that the United States will prevent any ships carrying weapons into Cuba. Now, on that same day, John F. Kennedy wrote a letter to Khrushchev saying that the one thing that has most concerned me has been the possibility that your government would not correctly understand the will and determination of the United States in any given situation, since I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country would win, and which only could result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor. Now, the next day, Khrushchev wrote back, pretty much saying that the missiles are only for defensive purposes. And Kennedy wrote back saying that, well, you started it. So, also, the same day, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was explaining the matter to the UN Security Council. Also the same day, U.S. ships were already on the move to position around the waters of Cuba. Now also, Soviet submarines were moving in to potentially stop a blockade or for any reason. Now on the 24th, Khrushchev sent a letter to Kennedy accusing him of threatening the Soviet Union, saying that you are no longer appealing to reason, but wish to intimidate us, he said. Now, on the 25th, most armed ships were returning back to Europe, but a specific oil tanker called the Bucharest is still approaching Cuba, and two warships were pretty much about to shoot it down or intercept it, but that could have led to war, and Kennedy didn't want that. So he decided to let it go through since it didn't have any contraband. Now, on the 26th of October, Castro sent a letter to the Russians to pretty much say, shoot the missiles at them. And the Soviet leader actually disagreed and instead sent a letter to the U.S. trying to de-escalate the war and ensure that they didn't doom the world to the catastrophe of a thermonuclear war. Now, the next day, U.S. U-2 pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down and killed over Cuba. Now, at this point, war was imminent, and Secretary of Defense said that they fired their first shot, and President Kennedy remarked that we are now in an entirely new ballgame. But John F. Kennedy correctly concludes that Khrushchev had not given the order to shoot down the plane, which pretty much gets both leaders to realize the true intents or the true risks of this situation, and both leaders realize that it's spiraling dangerously out of control. Now, on the same day, Khrushchev sent another letter to Kennedy, which he was demanding that the United States remove all its missiles from Turkey as part of the deal. And President Kennedy responds by offering to promise not to attack Cuba after the Russians withdraw. And that evening, Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, and said that the United States already planned to remove its missiles from Turkey, but couldn't even say so publicly. Now, the next day, on the 28th, Khrushchev concedes, writing an open letter to Kennedy saying that the Soviets will remove and dismantle all the missiles they sent to Cuba. And so the White House and Kennedy portrayed the withdrawal as a result of the president's tough stance in the face of Soviet aggression. But really, it was just a good resolution between two different sides. And so, yeah, that's how it pretty much ended, with the Soviets having to remove all the missiles under inspection of the United Nations, and the United States having to remove its missiles from Turkey and promise not to invade Cuba again. Now, another important thing that happened, which was pretty much the brink of war again, where one Russian submarine was inside of the whole quarantine in the naval blockade, pretty much, and they were being hit with death charges left and right, hitting the hull of the submarine. It was shaking like crazy, and so pretty much the people inside were thinking that there was a war happening outside, and so they thought to themselves that they should probably fire something. And so the U.S. ships depth charging them from above didn't know that it was a Soviet submarine carrying a nuclear torpedo, and they thought to themselves that they might as well shoot one of the ships down. So if they die, they'll at least get another ship. And so the ship had 3 captains, and all 3 of them had to unanimously agree to fire the torpedo. And 2 of them did, but one of them didn't. And his name was Vasily Alexandrovich, who pretty much shot down the idea and, yeah, pretty much saved us all. A 34-year-old man at the time saved us all from a nuclear war that could have ended very badly. Very, very badly. Now, what are some important effects from after the war? What did the crisis do? Well, not only did it, give a pretty bad, it left a bad taste in the mouth of the Cuban leader, who pretty much thought that the Russian leader was a chicken because he didn't fire any missiles. So they weren't really friends after that. But also, this did start a few, some better things happened. Like the U.S. and Soviets agreeing not to test any nuclear missiles above ground. So that's one good thing. And a lot of other things happened. I don't think I have enough time to say most of it. But one thing that did happen is that it led to it directly and indirectly led to a number of improvements to the international strategic environment, which included agreements to begin to restain the competition in nuclear arms. And one of the first results was the establishment of the Washington-Moscow hotline, less than 7 months after the crisis, which gave leaders in both countries a direct link during crises, and thereby reducing chances of misunderstanding. This hotline continues in operation to this very day. And so that's pretty much most of the things that occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope you were informed. I hope I didn't stutter that much. But yeah, maybe one day I'll make another episode of the GOATCAST. But that's another day. It is today. And in conclusion, I hope you enjoyed. And that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you for listening to the GOATCAST with Lucas Hamilton, the greatest podcast commentator of all time. Thank you.